Hi, world geographers. Dr. Devine here. Welcome to the lecture on global inequality, focusing on the World Inequality Report. I hope that you were able to make your way through the executive summary of the 300-page report. I'm going to help you understand some of the key ideas and the key figures that were presented to set us up for a reading that we will do on Wednesday that gets a little bit more into the lived experience of inequality. So this lecture is focusing on an economic perspective on the state of global inequality from a macroeconomic, a large-scale economic analysis. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to get into the lecture. All right. So here we are, the first lecture on global inequality this week. This is a political cartoon that, excuse me, I think really captures the state of affairs from a satirical perspective. Global inequality has been growing steadily since the 1980s, and we're living in one of the most unequal times in recent history. Certainly, if we go back to the 1910s, 1920s, the inequality of the distribution of wealth in America prior to the Great Depression, we're looking at similar levels. But following World War II and the implementation of the New Deal, certainly since the 1930s and 40s, we're living in a very unequal moment comparatively. So let's talk a little bit about what is income inequality. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about the distribution of the pie. Who has what percentage of the national wealth, of the world's wealth, okay? So this political cartoon shows the top 1% controls 46% of the world's wealth. That's pretty amazing, right? The top 1% of the world has nearly half of the world's wealth. That's what we mean by the unequal distribution of income. Global inequality studies the unequal distribution of income around the world. Let's dig into it. So the report. What is the aim of the World Inequality Report? Well, the report relies on cutting-edge methodology to measure income and wealth inequality. So wealth can include assets, right? Not just liquid asset money, but property and other forms of wealth. So the project uses sort of a new cutting-edge methodology with the most complete data set from around the world to measure income and wealth inequality in a systematic and transparent manner. By developing the report, the Inequality Lab seeks to fill a democratic gap and to equip various actors in society with the necessary facts to engage and inform public debates on inequality. So as you read in the executive summary, the goal of this report is not to create some consensus. And I want to ask you the question, why would it be so difficult to reach a consensus on global inequality? Well, as the report says, some measure of inequality is inherent, right? But the type of inequality that exists today is a reflection of policies and politics. And so, of course, this is a highly politicized issue. And people are never going to agree on sort of what the right level of inequality is, right? We can't have equality. This is a capitalist merit-based system. Some people are smarter, some people work harder, right? If we could take away all of the discrimination, the racism, the sexism, then we would have sort of, yes, inequality based on people's skill sets. But we know that structural racism in our society around the world does not equally distribute based on merit. We see wealth distributed along racial lines that reflects policies and history rather than one's innate abilities. So, we'll be getting to this question of what is the problem with inequality? Well, for one, inequality flags that poverty is often on the rise. And so when you have stark levels of inequality, a handful of people having the vast majority of wealth, obviously that means there's less to go around for other people. And if there's less to go around for other people, well, then you're not, people not being properly educated, properly taken care of in terms of their health. And if you're not properly taking care of people in terms of their education and health, and a society is not tapping into its human capital, its resources. The other thing too, folks, is that inequality can be bad for political stability. When you live in a country where there is vast inequality of wealth and people feel frustrated with the system that unequally distributes wealth along those lines, well, then you're often in a situation where there will be some political instability, some protest, and maybe some political changes in terms of the leadership of that country. And frankly, folks, the other big problem with inequality is that it results in people prematurely dying. It results in people not having their basic needs met. Okay, so it's not that inequality is bad in and of itself. Some measure of inequality exists in our society because people are not born equal. Okay, some people work harder than others. Resources are not distributed along merit lines, however. Past histories and policies get in the way of having a healthy level of inequality, and all of a sudden you have a level of inequality that corresponds to large scale and deep poverty. Remember when we were talking about the history of development? Less than half of the world, about half of the world lives on less than $5 a day. That's when inequality becomes a problem. There's enough money to feed the world. But if you have 1% of the population that has 46% of the world's wealth, and that means that the other 50% doesn't have enough to put food on the table, educate, healthcare, well, then that's when you have a problem, right? Inequality that breeds poverty, that is based on poverty, the 1% extracting that wealth through various labor relations and also corporate arrangements, right? So the problem, folks, is that global inequality has produced deep poverty. All right, so that's the aim of the report. What are some of the key findings of the report? We find, and I just wanted to mention here that this is a very prestigious group of economists that have put together this report. And I would encourage you to read up on its methodology and a little bit about its authors. This is really sort of first-rate economic analysis here. So, what are the findings? Well, the findings of the report here are that inequality has increased in nearly all world regions in recent decades, but at different speeds. The fact that inequality levels are so different among countries, even when countries share similar levels of development, highlights the important roles that national policies and institutions play in shaping inequality, okay? So we have differences in inequality, the rate of the growth of inequality, even when we compare sort of countries with similar development levels, okay? So within developing countries and within developed countries, first world countries, there are different rates of inequality, and this is a reflection of national policies and institutions. So income inequality varies greatly across world regions. So there's a lot of unevenness. There's a lot of inequality to the inequality and unevenness to this inequality. Inequality is the lowest in Europe, but the highest in the Middle East. Inequality within world regions varies. In 2016, the share of national income accounted for by just that nation's top 10%, the top 10%, not the top 1%, the top 10% of income earners was 37%. in Europe, 41% in China, 46% in Russia, and 47% in the US and Canada. Okay. In the Middle East, we have the most unequal region in the world, where the top 10% have 61% of the country's wealth. In recent decades, income inequality has increased in nearly all countries, but at different speeds, suggesting that institutions and policies matter in shaping inequality. Since 1980, income inequality has increased rapidly in North America, China, India, and Russia. Inequality has grown moderately in Europe. From a broad, I want you to listen to this, from a broad historical perspective, this increase in inequality marks the end of a post-World War II egalitarian regime, an equal regime focused on equality, which took different forms in these regions. I'm going to jump ahead here. What this is saying is that since the 1980, income inequality has increased. This increase marks the end of the post-World War II egalitarian regime that took different forms. In the United States, this took the form as the New Deal. In the Third World, it took the form of ISI, industrialization, import substitution, industrialization, economic protectionism. There was a large role of the state in this period from World War II to 1980, which marks the birth of neoliberalism. The state played a really large role in creating a social safety network, high taxes, investing in education, keeping education affordable, investing in mortgages, mortgage programs to grow the middle class. This came to an end in 1980. So what you see in that first page of that executive report is the identification of what we've been studying as neoliberalism, the neoliberal economic ideology, right? That marks the shift, that marked a dramatic change when this global inequality started taking off. So remind me, what are some of the neoliberal policies that we have been studying in this class? Well, we're talking about, yes, neoliberal policies that happen in the United States, happened in the UK with Thatcher and Reagan, right, who were seen as the Washington Consensus that implemented neoliberal reforms in the United States. What happened in the United States? Well, a lot of public companies were privatized, electric companies, waste management companies. A lot of the education sector was privatized. You have a mass privatization of state-owned industries, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. Cuts on social spending, cuts on those New Deal programs that really helped build up the middle class during this era. So what we're getting at here in this report, in so many words, is that the dramatic increase that we're going to look at of inequality around the world is a result of the implementation of neoliberal economic policies. Now, we studied how in third world countries like Jamaica, Mexico, neoliberal policies came in the form of structural adjustment policies that followed the debt crisis, those conditions that were attached to IMF loans. Okay, so neoliberalism happened around the world by choice in many first world countries, by the mechanism of debt in many third world countries. And in third world countries and in first world countries, free trade was promised again to rise all boats. But what we see in this data is that there was little trickle down, and that while some managers and CEOs of very powerful, wealthy companies got fantastically rich off of bringing back free trade and slashing funding for education, healthcare, and other programs, and reduced taxation, what we have here is an accumulation of wealth that has not trickled down to the middle class or the working class. What we have seen under the conditions of neoliberalism is a dramatic restructuring of who has what of the global economic pie that has benefited not just the top 10%, but the top 1%. So let's continue. Okay, so this is a graph of what we just looked at previously. The top 10% of national income in the world is owned by, in Europe, the top 10% of national income earners, the wealthiest 10% in the economy, have 37% of the world's of the country's wealth, right, and the region's wealth. In China, the top 10% of earners have 41, nearly half, right? 46% for Russia. We're going to be looking at how the introduction of capitalist reforms have fueled the growth of inequality, as you would imagine, in Russia, transitioning from a communist to a capitalist government. The United States and Canada, 47%. I'm interested and curious as to why they combine the US and Canada. I think this number would be much higher if it was just the US. Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, India, and the Middle East. So these are the most unequal regions and countries in the world. Interestingly, Brazil, like Guatemala, was one of, I think, those were the two countries in Latin America that did not have land reform, right? So that inequality today is a reflection of the past, that the colonial land holdings and the accumulation of the wealth by a few during colonialism was never redistributed through agrarian or social reforms like it was in many other Latin American countries. So here, another figure from your reading for today. Top 10% income shares around the world, rising inequality almost everywhere, but at different speeds. So this is looking at how the share of the wealth of that top 10%, how it's increased over time. So at the beginning of sort of the Washington Consensus and neoliberalism, beginning in 1980, we have the United States and Canada. The top 10% had about 34%. Today, we saw that is up to 46, the mid 40s. With India, we see a dramatic increase. With Russia, here we have the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Look at how inequality has grown in Russia. And a lot of that has to do with oil and the fast pace of capitalist reforms in that country. Oh, here we are. There are exceptions to the general pattern. In the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Brazil, income inequality has remained stable at extremely high levels. Having never gone through the post-war egalitarian regime, these regions set the world inequality frontier. So I just mentioned to you in the last slide that Brazil, like Guatemala, after the CIA overthrow of Arbenz and the installment of the military dictators, Guatemala's reversed land reform, and Brazil never having a land reform to break up that colonial inequality. These countries, yeah, they have an increase. It's always been super unequal. I like that term, the inequality frontier. They had never gone through, that Brazil had never gone through this period of post-World War II sort of egalitarian redistribution of resources, high taxation, high state investment in public programs. Okay, so here this graph is asking the question, basically looking at that top 10% of income earners, is the entire world becoming Brazil? Is the entire world becoming similar to Guatemala or Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of its income distribution? Oh, wow, that's so interesting, right? Why would it be that former colonies who hadn't gone through these major income and land redistribution programs, why would they be the inequality frontier? Well, their shared history is colonialism, right? And one of the themes of this course, we have been talking about how colonial rulers basically designed the infrastructure, the education system, the administration of those colonies for the extraction of wealth by a handful of foreigners at the expense of the vast majority, right? So, and in the Middle East, very interesting. You have, places like Qatar where people are basically making money off of oil revenues, and they recruit workers from third world countries like Nepal or the Philippines surrounding Indonesia, and they pay these workers pittances and put them in horrible labor camps. So it's, you have to be sort of thinking about those oil revenues that we've been talking about, this class, and playing a role in that inequality. So how has inequality evolved in recent decades among global citizens? We provide the first estimates of how the growth of global income since 1980 has been distributed across the totality of the world population. The global top 1% of income earners has captured twice as much of growth in the global economy as the poorest 50%. That means that as global productivity, global wealth has increased, the top 1% has captured twice as much of that growth as the bottom 50%. Who's producing the clothes? Who's producing the computer chips? Who's producing the cars? Who's growing the food, right? The workers are. But yet you have the people at the very top accumulating all of that wealth, garnering all of that wealth. It has a lot to do with, one, how much that top 1% pays their workers. And remember that a big part of neoliberalism meant relocating manufacturing to third world countries from places like the United States where labor was cheap. We're still paying, we're paying more for cars, for clothes, but yet wages have gone way down. And what does that mean? A bigger share of the profit goes to the company, that 1%. That is part of the story that we're seeing here in these figures. The bottom 50% has enjoyed important growth rates. The global middle class, which contains all of the poorest 90 income groups in the EU and the United States, has been squeezed, okay? So even, within the United States, when we talk about sort of the poor in the United States, if you put that on a global scale, because of how much money it takes to be middle class in this country, when you sort of look at stark sort of GDP per capita, what they're saying here is that the global middle class encompasses 90% of income groups in the United States. Okay, when you define the global middle class, that's most of America. But what they're saying is that this middle class has been squeezed dramatically. A lot of this wealth upwards, the top 1%, is coming from productivity among the middle class, but not wage increase to match that productivity. We're going to see that here. Oh my gosh. This graph blows my mind. The top 1% versus bottom, so the richest 1% versus the bottom half. National incomes in the US. This graph here is just US. We're going to look at Western Europe in the next slide. Okay, so what are we looking at? Between 1980 and 2016, what we have had from 1980, the bottom half of the US economy, half of the population, half of the US population that's in the bottom half of the income earners, which would by definition include a big chunk of the middle class. The bottom 50% had 21% of national wealth. Today, the lower half of income earners in our country has 13% of the national wealth. Half of America has gotten poor when we look at this group from 1980 to 2015. When we look at the top 1%, how much money they have, in 1980, the top 1% of the population had 11% of the wealth. That's still unequal, but that number doubles by 2015. The top 1% has doubled their share of the pie. And it has come at the expense of half of the US population. This is what the inequality report is getting at. Oh, and what's so fascinating, look at this. In 1996, talk about a neoliberal nightmare come true here. In 1996, the wealth of 1% of the US population surpasses the wealth of an entire half of the country. And look at the trajectory we're on. It just keeps going and going and going. A reversal of fortunes. In Europe, the situation is much, much different. In Europe, things look somewhat similar in the 1980s, but the bottom 50% in Western Europe still has 22% of the national wealth, and the 1% has increased from 10 to 12. So while in the US, it's gone from 11 to 20, 10 to 20, in the UK, the 1% has not increased their fortune at the same level. Now, how do we understand this wealth inequality? Well, yes, a lot of it has to do with the types of jobs and the changes in the global economy. We were talking about the outsourcing of manufacturing to the third world and the realization that wages are so much cheaper in third world countries. So companies like Nike or major manufacturers could still be charging $80 for a pair of shoes, but paying much less to make them. So that means more money at the top, right? More money than the company makes. But another big piece of it is the privatization of state resources, the privatization of state capital, which we call public capital. So the report asks the question, why does the evolution of private and public capital matter for inequality? And they say that economic inequality is largely driven by the unequal ownership of capital. Capital is referring, yes, to finances, but also to buildings, real estate, infrastructure. We show that since 1980, very large transfers of public to private wealth occurred in nearly all countries, whether rich or emerging, developing. While national wealth has substantially increased, public wealth is now negative or close to zero. Arguably, this limits the ability of governments to tackle inequality. Certainly, it has importance for inequality among individuals. Over past decades, countries have become richer, but governments have become poorer. So when we think about the privatization of all of those state-owned companies, of the state electric company, well, we still have a post office, but who knows, right? The post office might go to the United States Postal Service, and all we'll be left will be FedEx, right, or UPS. And they are, ooh, that's expensive. But what we're getting at is that when the privatization of all of these state-owned enterprises, the downsizing of these state companies, not only in things like healthcare, the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of, as that has been sold off, right? The state has lost its assets. So states own less, governments own less of the country's wealth than they did before. And if countries own less of the wealth, then they don't have enough materials, or they have less materials to fund things like healthcare, education, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, right? So you have to be thinking about these other dynamics as we're telling this story. And what we see here in China, here in the dark red, as China has undergone capitalist reforms, a lot of privatization of state-owned properties and enterprises, but this is a trend that holds across the world. Okay, so what are our new findings on global wealth inequality? The report argues that the combination of large privatizations and increasing income inequality within countries has fueled the rise of wealth inequality among individuals. Okay. In Russia and the United States, the rise of wealth inequality has been extreme, whereas in Europe it's been more moderate. Wealth inequality has not yet returned to its extremely high level early of 20th century levels in rich countries, in developed countries. So what we see here is the top 1% wealth shares across the world, the fall and the rise of personal wealth inequality. So again, we sort of talked about how in the pre-war era, pre-World War II, we had the really unequal global economy under the conditions of global liberalism, is this period I'm calling it here. And then with the global economic crisis of 1929, the New Deal, the state played a big role in high taxation and redistributing resources through aid programs like the GI Bill, funding mortgages, Social Security, unemployment, right? All of these mechanisms of sort of helping the bottom up. But since the implementation of neoliberalism, we have seen a reduction in state spending, the privatization of state resources, and the resulting global inequality. The global wealth middle class will be squeezed under business as usual. This most likely involves you. Remember that 90% of people in America fall within what is considered the global middle class. Rising wealth inequality within countries has helped spur increases in global wealth inequality. If we assume that the world trend is to be captured by the combined experience of China, Europe, and the US, the wealth share of the top 1% wealthiest people increased from 28 to 33%, while the share commanded by the bottom 75 hovered around 10% between 1980 and 2016. The continuation of past wealth inequality trends will see the wealth share of the top 0.1% global wealth owners catch up with the share of the global wealth middle class by 2015. Okay, so here we have, this is sort of the global middle class here, the top 1%. And what we're seeing here is that, you know, basically we're continuing on these trends in which the global middle class, which includes 90% of Americans, will have as much money in 2015 as the top 0.1% in the world. Not 1%, 0.1%. So this money is coming not just from poor countries. This money is being squeezed out of middle-class Americans who have not seen their wages rise since the 1970s. If you go back to that David Harvey figure, and I should have put it in this slide. I'll bring it back. I should put this slide in now that I think about it. I'll come back to that. You look at that slide that Harvey has when we talked about neoliberalism, and he shows how the productivity of US American workers continues to increase, but wages has stayed the same. The difference between productivity and wages is called profit. That increasing profit is being captured by the top 1% rather than being shared equitably among workers. I don't know about you, I have been seeing some pretty snarky comments on social media about how Jeff Bezos has made $27 billion since COVID-19, but yet Amazon can't afford health insurance for its employees. Can't or won't? I'll let you think about that. Okay, so inequality has substantial impacts on global poverty. Okay. Annual income per adult. This is sort of looking at this idea of inequality and global poverty. What I need you to understand is that when global inequality gets so exacerbated that the bottom rungs don't have enough money to live on or buy healthcare or food or decent education, housing, etc., that's when global poverty, that's when global inequality becomes a problem of poverty. That inequality, not the lack of production, but the distribution of profits, right? That's when inequality becomes a problem. When inequality, vast inequality exists alongside deep-seated poverty. And if you remember back to one of our development lectures, and I've said it a couple of times recently, half of the world's population lives on less than $5 a day, right? So nobody, not Jeff Bezos, did not make $27 billion. He took $27 billion from his company. He didn't earn that money. It was the people loading the trucks, filling the orders. Those are the people that collectively produce that wealth. Nobody makes $10 million. That's $10 million that is taken from the profit earned by a company collectively. So the report ends by suggesting some measures that can be taken to address global inequality. Well, tax progressivity is a proven tool to combat rising income and wealth inequality at the top. What does this mean? What is a progressive taxation structure versus a flat taxation structure? A flat taxation structure means that it doesn't mean if you're Jeff Bezos or if you're a student in 1310, everybody's paying 10% of their wealth to taxes. Our progressive tax system states that the more money that you make, the higher the tax bracket you fit into. So you could go and do some digging and look at how taxation rates have changed in the United States, but I've thrown enough statistics and tables at you. You can take my word for it or go do research on your own. Taxation rates were much higher, especially for those top tiers of those income earners in the United States during that period of Keynesianism, during that period of economic nationalism, of state-led growth. Okay, now with neoliberalism, tax rates among the uber rich were dropped substantially. And the theory, the explanation of neoliberalism was that the money saved by the rich would be invested back into companies so they would produce more jobs and everybody would benefit. Folks, has everybody benefited? What's trickling down? Has it trickling down? It's not trickling down. It's not trickling down. The wealthy are getting uber rich. And the benefits of increased productivity of those tax saving mechanisms have not benefited the vast majority of people. So this group of international economists are actually arguing for progressive tax measures, not taxing the wealthy and asking them to pay their fair share is part of the problem. And I want you just to sort of think through the example of, how money is relative, right? I mean, it's kind of akin to this idea that, or it could be thought of along the lines of, if you as a college student right now who's maybe struggling to make rent or to pay your food bills, if you get a speeding ticket for $300, right? Is that the same type of punishment that if Jeff Bezos or a top admin in Texas State University got pulled over and had a $300 parking ticket or speeding ticket? What I'm getting at here is that, $300 to a college student may be felt quite differently than $300 to a person who has a lot of money, right? And what's pretty interesting is that you want to sort of think about, how much money really does one need? And if you are the owner of a major corporation like HEB, paying large taxes, well, geez, those taxes pay for the roads and pay for the schools that are going to produce the workers that you're going to employ and make money off of when they finally get to be adults, as society has invested 12 to 16 years of education in, right? So sometimes companies, I think, should pay higher tax rates because they profit more off the investment that society has made in the labor force. And by the way, they're in a position to do so. So sometimes, people make the argument that richer people should pay more because, one, they benefit more from the social products of the labor system and the education system, but also because they're in a position to do so, each according to their own needs and abilities. Number two, a global financial register recording the ownership of financial assets would deal severe blows to tax evasion, money laundering, and rising inequality. This is going to blow your mind. The IMF in 2019, here's the link, reports that an entire 10% of the world's wealth is in tax havens, offshore accounts. Because those rich people, the 1%, the 0.01%, don't want to pay taxes on all of that money. And so they hide that money in tax havens, offshore accounts. 1 out of every $10 on the planet is in some sort of tax evasion system. And, folks, like, gosh, is it still not enough? Is it still not enough? You've got so much money. I just don't know where people are coming from, honestly, in terms of refusing to pay taxes. Guatemala, of course, Guatemala has one of the lowest tax rates in the world. The wealthy do not pay taxes. If you really sort of believe in this idea of no tax, Guatemala is kind of a good place for you to think about and see how that system works. If you don't have enough money for taxes, you don't have enough money for education, for healthcare, taxation. If the state doesn't own or run any businesses, then taxation is all that's left in terms of, one of the main mechanisms left for the state to make some money. But if you cut that financial revenue, you start to see why the poor are doing so poorly. More equal access to education and well-paying jobs is key to addressing stagnating income for the poorest half of the world's population. So they're saying states have a role to play in investing in education and well-paying jobs. States need to invest in the future to address current income and wealth inequality levels and to prevent future increases in them. Okay. So we'll come back to this on Wednesday. We're going to learn a little bit more about neoliberalism's impacts around the world, of which rising income inequality is certainly one of them. We'll be looking at that on Wednesday. In the meantime, I look forward to seeing your comments and questions online. Please do not forget to take your quiz for today, and we'll see you next time. I hope that you're all doing well.